and Joseph Smith has this. Do you think there's nothing? I'll call your bluff. This theme, Enoch doesn't get the source of these ideas. This is a witness to the common Jewish view that the angels were the attendants at God's court. God had a court, the angels were there. This is beautiful exposition here. The Messiah was also present there. The Messiah was in the court of God, according to Bernardin. The earliest New Testament passage in Mark 8:38, this is where the Lord says, whoever is ashamed of me, I will be ashamed of the Father about them. And when he comes in glory with his Father and his holy angels, here is the picture of the Son of Man coming to judge the world, clothed with the dignity and the power of the Father, and accompanied by the heavenly court. It is a court of judgment on Israel and the world. That is part of the total work of the council of the gods. This brings it all the way up into New Testament times. I think that's fascinating. Christ is coming back with the council of the gods to judge the world, because that is part of their function. The Son of Man comes with the combined dignity and authority of himself, of the Father, and the holy angels. These three are the divine inhabitants of heaven. William F. Albright, in a review of one of the books in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1948, this is on page 377, he says, now, he's discussing this concept of the Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, and the ancient Jewish Israelite understanding of their God Yahweh was as a warrior, as a divine warrior. And the hosts of heaven was his army. Now, the hosts of heaven are interesting because they are not only the angels, and they are not only, well, the Father is part of this, of course, but it's also the planets, the clouds, the wind. It's very interesting. The hail, the heat, the cold. The actual weather are part of the host of heaven, as are the stars. It's so interesting that he says he is the God of the stars. He is the God of the angels. He is the God of the elements of nature. He is the God of demons. He is the master of the universe. Our cartoon, Master of the Universe. Yeah, that's an imitation of the God in the council of the gods. He is the master of the universe. Yahweh Sabaoth is the all-powerful God, or rather the irresistible God. He says this on page 378. He says he was the divine protector of his people. The same divine protector of Israel is also expressly designated by the prophets as the master of the universe, the Lord of all nations, and the Lord of all the cosmic forces. Other articles that I have discuss this theme of God being a God over the elements, and he uses those elements to further his work, whether in a supportive capacity or as a judgmental capacity. Yahweh Sabaoth is tied directly to the Ark of the Covenant with the cherubim, the cherubim on that Ark of the Covenant. And he comes and dwells between the cherubim, and he is with Israel. The Ark of the Covenant plays a very important role with Yahweh as the head master of the council of the gods. And he says, this is on page 381 in this same book review, he says, after the verbal force of Yahweh as a word lost its meaning, Yahweh Sabaoth came to mean the Lord of hosts, and the alternative expression, Yahweh Elo Sabaoth, was Yahweh, God of hosts. And it designated also the holiest cult object of Israel that was placed at the head of every Israelite army as they went into battle, especially against the Philistines. We've got that in the Old Testament, namely the Ark of the Covenant. George Barton, one of the great biblical scholars at the early 1900s, in his article here on the kinship of gods and men among the early Semites. Now, this was in the Journal of Biblical Literature for 1896. And some of the information that he has in this has not been refuted or outdated. It has taken on a broader, deeper, more powerful meaning and understanding. So I want to kind of give you the foundational study of this theme, that there is a kinship among the gods and men. And in fact, it's a direct physical kinship. He doesn't mamby-pamby and philosophize and spiritualize it away into a metaphor. It was taken literally by the early Semites. And his article is fascinating in that regard with the evidence that he deduces. He says passages like Genesis 6 verse 2, go read that. You're going to have your eyes opened here. I was stunned when I read this. What a way to look at it. And I think Thorkild Jacobson has written on this also now. He says passages like Genesis 6:2, this is on page 174, exhibits a conception of relationship between gods and men which would make the conception of physical sonship possible. Now go read Genesis 6:2 and see. But he's not done yet. On page 175 he says, the early Semites held to the fatherhood of the God. That's literal, not spiritual. And he discusses that in his article here. He says there is a physical basis in an original conception of actual descent from a deity. Such conceptions as those of Genesis 6:2, the Gilgamesh epic, and those embodied in the regulations of the Temple of Bel at Babylon, to which Herodotus testifies, the language of Ishtar in the Babylonian account of the deluge, in which she claims to be the mother of men, the fact that some Semites claimed descent from deities, as well as the language from Jeremiah, who say to a tree, thou art my father, and to a stone, thou hast brought me forth. These passages compel us to understand that the primitive Semitic conception of human and divine relationship was one of physical kinship. He says that on page 176. Very interesting. Among the early Semites, the conception of physical sonship of deity or to deity was possible. Very interesting. He does not deny that a man may call himself a son of God, but that he could call himself the brother of God. The idea is not only are we sons, but we're also related, that we're also brothers to the gods. Very interesting here, man. Page 181, more of Barton. I've got this whole thing just marked up all over the place. It's fascinating. I'm just giving you some highlights. The conception of physical brotherhood with deity is a conception the early Semites would be very likely to entertain. And he says, the etymological aspects of some of the Hebrew names, such as Ahiel and Ahimelech, may be taken as proof that the conception was entertained, because it's a hypochristicon, it's a theophoric name. It's a name of a deity put on with the name of a regular human. He says the word for Av, father, the Hebrew word, means more than just descent or father. It can mean procreator, because we come from the gods. And it can mean brother to the god. It means father, husband, brother, companion. All these basic themes overlap in that Hebrew word of, aleph and beit, of. It's much broader than just the idea of father. This is on page 182. It meant nourisher, caretaker, provider. It may well be in a system of fraternal polyandry. The Semites could conceive of physical relations with deity. For the early time, there was no hard and fast line between fatherhood and brotherhood. If the idea of physical kinship of descent be admitted, it naturally, in the primitive days, carried fraternal kinship with it. So we conclude we are justified in rendering Ahia, my brother is Yah, if Yah be a divine name. We are the brothers of Yahweh.